Thank you, Mehmet, for that introduction, and thank you all for being willing to engage with me on the issue of voluntary slavery in First Clement. I should say that this is a paper that I actually already published in 2022 in this book edited by Bruce Longenecker. And I'm not generally in the habit of recycling materials. I presented this at the New Testament seminar, so Josh has to sit through this again, at least. And I'm currently working on First Clement. I'm very interested in First Clement. I'm preparing the volume on First Clement for the Oxford Apostolic Fathers series. So I have things more recent that I could talk about related to First Clement, including issues of authorship. I'm going to Boston over the weekend for the AAR SBL meeting, giving a paper on authorship of First Clement. But I'm very happy to talk about this topic because it's an issue that has sort of stuck with me, and it raises a number of questions that I haven't been able to get out of my mind. And I'm really thinking seriously about writing doing a larger project about the phenomenon of voluntary slavery in early Christianity. But there's not a lot of evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So this is a really fascinating text, and I think it raises lots of questions about social practices in the early church. So I haven't left this behind, and I'll say more at the end. There's also some developments that have happened, scholarly developments since I first wrote this paper. A book came out, I guess, last year called Roman Inequality that has a whole chapter on the phenomenon of self-sale in the Roman world, which raised for me all sorts of questions and it gave me new ways of thinking about what's going on in First Clement. So, let me begin. In September of 1732, two Moravians, David Nishman, a carpenter, and Leonard Dober, a potter, arrived in Copenhagen, Denmark. They had traveled from Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf's Moravian community in Saxony. Nitschmann and Dober had journeyed to Copenhagen in hopes of booking passage on a ship of the Danish West India Company to St. Thomas, a Danish colony in the Caribbean, so that they might serve as missionaries among slaves there. Unusually, Nitschmann and Dober intended to sell themselves as slaves in order that they might have the opportunity to live among the objects of their missionary instruction. For this reason, the Moravian slaves, as they have come to be known, have been lionized by Christians for their sacrificial love on behalf of the slaves to whom they proclaimed the gospel. In one popular version of their story, repeated in countless sermons and memorialized in at least one modern Christian hymn, as emotional family members stood on the shore to say goodbye, the Moravian slaves, or at least one of the Moravian slaves, raised his hand and cried out, "May the Lamb who was slain receive the reward for his suffering," which is the title of a hymn memorializing that moment. As is often the case, however, reality is more complex than hagiography. After resistance to their plan from the leadership of the Danish West India Company, Nitschmann and Dober were forced to procure their own travel to St. Thomas. Moreover, and importantly, the Moravian missionaries were actually prevented from selling themselves into slavery. The reasons for the censure of their voluntary enslavement are multifaceted, but prominent among them, as narrated in Catherine Gerbner's excellent monograph, Christian Slavery, was the conviction among many early 18th century European Protestants that neither whites nor Christians could be slaves. The racialized elements of the resistance to Nitschmann and Dober's plan are perhaps unsurprising, as New World slavery was almost entirely defined along racial lines by the 18th century. The senior chamberlain of the Danish West India Company is said to have responded to the Moravians' plan for voluntary enslavement by saying, "We don't let white people do that." Yet there existed throughout Protestant colonies in North America, especially among Anglican, Dutch Reformed and Lutheran slave owners, an earlier caste system, not exactly codified on racial terms, which maintained that Christians could not be slaves and slaves could not be Christians. Gerbner calls this the ideology of Protestant supremacy. For European planters on the island of St. Thomas in the 1730s, the very notion of a Christian mission to slaves was controversial, even unimaginable, because of the conviction that a Christian identity and a slave identity were incompatible. Thus, while Nitschmann and Dober's plan to live as slaves among slaves was rejected in part because they were white, it was also disallowed because they were Christians. Indeed, Gerbner demonstrates that the Moravian missionaries were early proponents of what she terms Christian slavery, namely, quote, an attempt to Christianize and reform slavery while maintaining its basic structures. After all, following relatively brief and difficult tenures as missionaries in St. Thomas, Nitschmann left after about 6 months in April of 1733, while Dober remained until the summer of 1734. Both of the so-called Moravian slaves returned to Europe with young black boys in their possession as slaves. By 1737, Moravian missionaries in St. Thomas had purchased a plantation and 30 to 40 slaves, and later, as one of the founders of the allegedly egalitarian Moravian community in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, then Bishop Nitschmann was involved in the purchase and importation of slaves from St. Thomas in order to address a labor shortage at Bethlehem. So, history is often much more complicated and darker than hagiography. The tale of Nitschmann and Dober is known as one of the few instances of voluntary slavery for missional purposes in the Christian tradition, even though the Moravian slaves were never actually slaves, and despite the fact that their mission reflected and supported the ideology of Protestant supremacy. Yet there is an ancient, perhaps more historically compelling reference to Christian self-enslavement from the letter called 1 Clement. Christ followers in the 1st and 2nd centuries did not have the luxury or the power to debate whether slaves could be Christians, nor would such a question have made sense to them. The earliest literary evidence clearly indicates that slaves were indeed participants in Christian associations, as we see from Paul's letters and in 1 Peter and in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch and in the Didache, among others. How exactly slaves participated in nascent Christ groups and to what extent their freedom was either supported or discouraged are questions that have generated much debate in scholarship. In the present paper, I shall consider a somewhat overlooked text that offers a window into the practice of voluntary enslavement for the purpose of providing material assistance to others with the proceeds from the sale of one's own body. Our text is from a letter called 1 Clement. This 1st or 2nd century letter from Christ followers in Rome to the ecclesia or the assembly in Corinth, an epistle conventionally called 1 Clement, provides this reference to voluntary enslavement among early Christians. And since I suspect maybe some of you in this room are not that familiar with 1 Clement, let me just describe it briefly so we have some sense of the text that I'm going to discuss. The letter called 1 Clement purports to be a collectively written epistle from the Church of Rome to the church in Corinth. It's a relatively long letter, about 10,000 words in Greek. For point of comparison, Paul's letter to the Church of Rome is about 7,000 words. So 1 Clement covers 65 chapters. The name Clement came to be attached to the letter by the 3rd century, although the earliest manuscript evidence and the earliest literary evidence does not directly identify a figure called Clement as the author of the text. This is actually what I'm going to be talking about in Boston on Monday, how the text got to be named or associated with a figure called Clement. Here's the earliest an image from the earliest Greek manuscript that we have of the text, Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. And if you've had Greek, you might be able to decipher at the very top of there. It says pros Corinthios A, to the Corinthians, letter A. But the letter, I think, in the earliest manuscript that we have, which is a Coptic translation, it's just called the letter from the Romans to the Corinthians. And there's a really interesting story, which we don't have time to get into, about how the name Clement got attached to this particular text. So I will call it First Clement, even though I personally don't think anyone named Clement wrote the letter. But that's another story for another day. It comes to be called First Clement because in the Greek manuscripts that we have, or at least the two earliest that we have from the 5th century and from the 11th century, it is associated with another letter that in both manuscripts is called Second Clement, even though I and many other people think Second Clement has nothing to do with First Clement, was written by a different person for a totally different context, but in the manuscripts these letters are connected. The letter called First Clement, which as I said is relatively long, despite its length, is laser focused on one particular issue. Namely, it is an attempt to convince the Corinthians to cease a recent schism that they have been involved in by restoring deposed presbyters or bishops to their rightful office. So it's a long letter. We don't know why this schism appears to have happened in Corinth. There are various reasons that had been proposed. Maybe it's economic, maybe it's the young versus the old. There's all sorts of theories. But it is relatively clear that there's been a division in Corinth, and certain presbyteroi or episcopoi, I think the terms are essentially synonymous in First Clement. These leaders have been taken away from their positions of leadership, and the church in Rome is convinced that this is a bad thing. And so they write this long letter trying to convince the Corinthians to restore into their proper positions of leadership those who've been deposed from their office. And also to encourage those responsible for the schism to leave, to pursue what you might call voluntary exile. This is the point that they make in chapter 54. So that's the sort of larger context. The letter, as I said, purports to be collectively authored, even though it probably was one particular person who actually wrote it. The letter begins by identifying the sender as the church of God that sojourns in Rome, to the church of God that sojourns in Corinth, to those who are called and sanctified by the will of God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So the whole letter is really only about one issue, which is making sure that these leaders get put back in their rightful position. And it's in that context that the authors of the letter called First Clement refer to a practice of voluntary slavery. They write in chapter 55, "We know that many among us have handed themselves over into bonds so that they might ransom others. Many have sold themselves into slavery with the price received for themselves, and with the price received for themselves have fed others." So I'd like to do three things in this lecture today. First, I'll just briefly comment on the question whether this actually happened or whether this is a kind of rhetorical device. So I'll locate this statement in light of the kind of rhetorical practices or strategies of the letter as a whole. Second, I'll talk about the connection between First Clement and First Corinthians, which raises some interesting questions about how the writers of this letter are interpreting Paul's letter to the church in Corinth that we call First Corinthians, which they know about and have presumably have access to. And then third, I'll reflect on the particular survival strategy of voluntary slavery in light of a very influential thesis advanced by Orlando Patterson, that slavery should be understood as a social death, a status characterized by violence, natal alienation, and dishonor. And I will suggest that First Clement offers a brief glimpse into the experience of slavery among some Christ followers that challenges the model of slavery as social death, and I'll try to explain what that means. And then at the very end, I will gesture towards some lingering questions that I have about this text and its place in early Christianity. So let's start by looking at this text in its rhetorical context. Should the assertion that found in 1 Clement 55 that many Christ followers have had themselves imprisoned and sold themselves into slavery in order to benefit others be viewed as a reliable claim? Is this something that even happened? Or is this an exaggeration or perhaps even an invention for rhetorical effect? The question is important because of the possibility that 1 Clement 55 might offer evidence for the rather unusual practice of beneficent self-enslavement. As a whole, the letter called 1 Clement represents, I think, a very fine illustration of deliberative rhetoric that makes an extended appeal for peace and harmony. This is seen in chapter 63, where the authors say, you will give us great joy and gladness if you obey what we have written through the Holy Spirit and root out the unlawful anger of your jealousy in accordance with the appeal for peace and harmony that we have made in this letter. So that's what they're attempting to do. And a distinguishing feature of the tradition of deliberative rhetoric was the use of examples, both historical and contemporary, to encourage a desired course of action. It's not surprising, therefore, that the argument of 1 Clement is replete with positive examples to imitate and negative examples to avoid. So when the argument of the letter kind of kicks off in chapter 4, the whole 4 through 16, chapters 4 through 16, are just a list of examples to emulate positively or to avoid negatively. So the reference to voluntary imprisonment and enslavement in chapter 55 appears in the context of the author's appeal for those responsible for the schism in Corinth to remove themselves from the situation through voluntary exile. This is the point that they make in chapter 54. Let the person responsible for the schism say, if it is my fault that there are rebellions and strife and schisms, I retire. I will go wherever you wish and will do whatever is ordered by the people. Only let the flock of Christ be at peace with its duly appointed presbyters. So having proposed that the leaders of the faction responsible for the division in Corinth should depart willingly, the authors provide examples of sacrificial love, beginning with some examples from the nations, which includes the claim that many kings and rulers, being prompted by some oracle, have given themselves over to death so that they might rescue subjects through their own blood. And if you want to ask me about the role of blood and soteriology in 1 Clement, I've got some ideas about that as well. But that's maybe a different topic for a different day. This then leads them to, it is in this context that the authors of 1 Clement write of those who have handed themselves over to bonds and those who have sold themselves into slavery. So in the next section, we'll consider practices of voluntary imprisonment and slavery in historical contexts. But for now, assuming that these were things theoretically that one could do in the 1st or 2nd century CE, it's sufficient, I think, just to make a couple of points regarding the plausibility of the claim that the authors make that many among us have done these things. First, the Romans explicitly draw upon shared knowledge of these sacrificial acts, employing a first-person plural form of the verb that is used elsewhere to talk about their shared knowledge of the sacred scriptures. This is in chapter 53. Second, the agents of these vicarious practices are specifically said to be many among us. The phrase en humin binds together the Christ followers in Rome and in Corinth by highlighting their participation in a united community. I actually think that's part of the general rhetorical approach of the letter, constantly to use the first person plural with reference to us or we, uniting the Corinthians and the Romans together in this sort of common appeal that the authors are making. The phrase also indicates that those who have willingly had themselves imprisoned to ransom others and sold themselves into slavery are members of Christ's assemblies, in contrast to the example of pagan rulers that's given in 55:1, and to the scriptural figures Judith and Esther, who are referenced in 55:3 and 6. It seems unlikely to me that the authors of 1 Clement have offered examples of voluntary imprisonment and slavery simply as a rhetorical fiction. Had these self-sacrificial acts been unknown to readers in Corinth, or even if readers would have suspected the examples of being untrue, the point of highlighting these acts of vicarious sacrifice, if not the appeal of the entire letter, would be undermined. Moreover, this characterization of self-giving love fits with the portrayal of the Corinthians elsewhere in the letter, even if the authors of 1 Clement perhaps offer an idealized depiction of the past aimed at promoting harmony in Corinth in the present. In the opening of the letter, for example, the Corinthians are praised for, among other things, their impressive habit of hospitality, and they are said to have been more glad to give than to receive in 2:1. Additionally, the authors of 1 Clement appear to allude to the practice of sacrificial mutual aid among the Corinthians in 2:6 and 7, when they write, "All rebellion and all schism were detestable to you," that is, in the past. "You used to mourn because of the offenses done to your neighbor. You considered their needs to be your own. You were without regret in every act of doing good, ready for every good work." Most English translations of 1 Clement 2:6 understand the phrase ta husteremata autun, their needs, to refer to moral shortcomings. Yet this statement, I think, should be taken as an allusion to practices of economic assistance among the Corinthians. In 1 Clement 38:2, the only other instance of the word husterema in the letter, it clearly means material needs. There, the authors advocate a relationship of mutual exchange between the strong and the weak. Let the rich person provide for the poor person, and let the poor person give thanks to God because God gave him one through whom he might supply his need, the same word that's used in chapter 2. Thus, according to 1 Clement 2, before the schism, the Corinthians were known for taking on as their own the material needs of their abused neighbors. While this praise for the Corinthians' past behavior is clearly part of the author's rhetorical strategy in the letter, it would not be effective if it were completely a fabrication. So I think, and other scholars also think, that they're referring to real examples, that this isn't just a fiction, that they really know about people who've voluntarily had themselves imprisoned or sold themselves into slavery for the benefit of others. And if that's the case, can we locate that among practices known to us from other associations or groups in the ancient world? A very good book that was published a few years ago by Philip Harland and Richard Last is entitled Group Survival in the Ancient Mediterranean. And so they talk about what collective groups did to survive, to continue to exist in light of often very harsh and difficult economic conditions. And among the group's survival strategies highlighted by Harland and Last, two are especially noteworthy for our purposes. One is the provision of funds or assistance to group members who had come into legal trouble, including imprisonment. And the second is the use of community funds to pay for the manumission of slaves. While there are parallels between the survival strategies that Harland and Last identify among Greco-Roman associations and the deeds mentioned in 1 Clement 55, it does appear, to me at least, that voluntary enslavement for the sake of others is distinctive among known practices from associations in the ancient Mediterranean. In the first instance, the authors of 1 Clement report an awareness that, quote, many among us have handed themselves over into bonds so they might ransom others. We do know that care for prisoners was a valued practice referenced in a number of early Christian texts, like the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25, or Philippians chapter 2, or Ignatius's letters, or Justin Martyr's first apology. How exactly the voluntary imprisonment of some might result in the ransom of others is not explicitly detailed. Perhaps the most plausible situation would involve some Christ followers going surety For others, imprisoned due to outstanding debts, which is a very common reason for imprisonment in the ancient Mediterranean world. If you didn't pay your debts, you were put into prison until you or someone else could pay them. Although Livy reports that Roman legislation to eliminate debt bondage was passed in 326 BCE, and later laws attempt to offer protection to debtors from physical coercion, the practice of imprisoning debtors is nevertheless well attested. One legal note from Oxyrhynchus, for example, from 23 CE, records the willingness of a certain Theon to stand surety for a prisoner named Serapion. Theon agrees either to produce Serapion within a month or else pay the debt or be imprisoned himself. So we have many examples of things like this happening. The authors of 1 Clement then refer to voluntary slavery. Many have sold themselves into slavery and with the price received for themselves have fed others. The practice of selling oneself into slavery was known in antiquity, although the extent to which the slave population in the Roman world was supplied by self-sale is very much debated. Voluntary enslavement is not mentioned frequently in literary sources, perhaps because the subject was taboo, or because it represented a challenge to ideals of freedom. Later Roman legal traditions suggest that individuals might have sold themselves into slavery. Maybe one reason is in order to attain employment that could offer a path of economic improvement, such as management of an estate. Or, I think more commonly, destitute freed persons might have viewed slavery as a means of providing for themselves and or family members, and I think in many cases as the only means of providing financial, the means to survive for themselves or for others. The few instances in which voluntary slavery is mentioned in extant literary sources have been well discussed. So, for example, there's the case of the acerbic freedman Hermeros, while arguing with a fellow diner at Trimalchio's banquet in Petronius's Satyricon, indicates that he had been a slave because, as he asserts, I sold myself into slavery preferring to be a Roman citizen rather than a taxpayer. Hermeros goes on to describe the economic advantages he enjoys as a Roman freedman, having purchased his own freedom for 1,000 denarii. In this instance, Hermeros appears to have become a slave from a position of relative privilege in order to enhance his economic prospects. Yet it's difficult to know how representative this fictional and satirical portrayal is of the experience of those real persons who did sell themselves into slavery. So I think we have to be very wary of asserting the uniqueness of early Christian practices of mutual aid in contrast to an alleged lack of charity within pagan associations. At the same time, the reference to beneficent voluntary slavery in 1 Clement is unusual when considered in light of practices of group survival among associations in the ancient Mediterranean, even though the authors of 1 Clement recognize that pagans made sacrifices as well, as we see in 54:1 with the reference to kings and leaders willingly giving their own lives for others. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, the reference to voluntary enslavement in 1 Clement 55 is also rare in the context of early Christian writings. I'd be happy to be corrected, but I'm not aware of other references to practices of voluntary enslavement in Christian literature before a couple of references in two different monastic writings, one from the 5th and one from the 7th century. That is Serapion the Sidonite, who features in Palladius's Lausaic history, and Peter, a Cyprian shop owner who is mentioned in Leontius's Life of St. John the Almsgiver. The authors of 1 Clement reveal very little about the circumstances that led some Christ followers to sell themselves into slavery, aside from the fact that the price they received was used to feed others. Jennifer Glancy, in her book on slavery in early Christianity, argues that 1 Clement 55 refers to, quote, free persons who were so desperate that they would sell themselves into slavery because self-sale was the only way they could provide food for others. I think that's certainly possible. Yet while poverty could certainly be a reason for voluntary self-enslavement, the text of 1 Clement 55 does not actually indicate that those who gave themselves into slavery were destitute. Nor are readers told of those to whom these Christ followers sold themselves. Did they sell themselves to other members of an ecclesia or a church or an association, Christian association, in hopes of avoiding the sexual violations or idolatry that would befall those whose bodies belonged to pagan enslavers? Much is left unsaid. Yet this positive example Corinthians to consider 1 Clement in light of 1 Corinthians. There is very little doubt that the authors of 1 Clement possessed the letter known as 1 Corinthians. They refer to it explicitly in chapter 47. Take up the epistle of the blessed Paul the Apostle, almost certainly with reference to 1 Corinthians. As an earlier text, penned by an esteemed apostolic figure that corrects schismata or division in Corinth, this is 1 Corinthians 1:10, driven by competing allegiances to ecclesiastical leaders, 1 Corinthians offers the writers an ideal literary template and a rich source of argumentation for their own appeal to peace and harmony in Corinth. So I think a lot of what you see in 1 Clement, it evokes tropes or arguments that Paul makes in his letter, in his own letter to the Corinthians. It is all the more interesting then that the endorsement given to those Christ followers who sold themselves into slavery in 1 Clement 55 would seem to contradict the apostle's own instructions regarding the avoidance of slavery in 1 Corinthians 7:23. Because in a discussion of God's calling in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul provides this instruction to the Christ group in Corinth: let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. The translation of 1 Corinthians 7:21 is very much debated, but the NRSV says, but if you can gain your freedom, actually this is my revision of the NRSV, avail yourself of the opportunity. The NRSV actually indicates that people should remain in slavery, which I think is not the right reading. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when called is a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters. How do we reconcile the commendation of those who had sold themselves into slavery in 1 Clement with Paul's directive not to become slaves of human masters in 1 Corinthians, especially in light of the ostensible reverence given to 1 Corinthians by the authors of 1 Clement? It's not an easy question to answer, but I might suggest a couple of possibilities. One is that there are a number of interesting linguistic parallels between 1 Clement 55 and 1 Corinthians 13:3, where Paul says, if I give away all my possessions and if I hand over my body, this is the NRSV, so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Some of you may know that there are textual variants in 1 Corinthians 13:3 that would suggest that perhaps what Paul says is not so that I might boast, but so that I may burn, or if I will burn. And people have taken this, if you take those variants, as a reference to the branding that slaves would sometimes receive as an indication of the mark of their ownership. So if it's the case that Paul says, so that I might burn, is his reference to handing over his body so that he might burn a reference to his own entertainment of the idea that he might have given himself voluntarily as a slave? It's an interesting question that I don't know we can entirely solve, because even if the Roman authors of the letter called 1 Clement were aware of a version of 1 Corinthians 13 that read, so that I might burn or that I will burn, it's not entirely clear that this would have been interpreted as a reference to self-enslavement, and if so, how such a reference might have been reconciled with Paul's ostensible prohibition of becoming slaves of human masters in 1 Corinthians 7:23. whatever might have been the relationship between 1 Clement 55 and 1 Corinthians 13, it's also evident that the authors of 1 Clement drew upon the wider context of 1 Corinthians 14 to frame their appeal to love, especially in chapter 49 of 1 Clement, in what is called an encomium to love. They give this sort of almost poetic, it's like a beautiful reflection on the nature of love, which clearly draws upon and evokes 1 Corinthians 13. So the authors of 1 Clement write, "Let the one who has love in Christ practice the precepts of Christ. Who can describe the bond of God's love? Who can sufficiently express the greatness of its beauty? The height to which love leads is indescribable. Love binds us to God. Love covers a multitude of sins. Love endures all things, is patient in all things. There is nothing vulgar in love, nothing proud. Love has no schism. Love does not cause division. Love does all things in harmony. In love, everyone chosen by God has been made perfect. Without love, nothing is pleasing to God. In love, the Master has received us. On account of the love he had for us, Jesus Christ our Lord gave his blood for us by God's will, his flesh for our flesh, his life for our life." So with clear reference to 1 Corinthians 13, and I think also 1 Peter 4:8, love covers a multitude of sins, the authors of 1 Clement recall and reshape Paul's own memorable reflections on agape in order to address the context of schism and division in Corinth. This evocation of 1 Corinthians 13 will be remembered when, a few chapters later, the authors turn to the issue of voluntary exile for those responsible for the division in Corinth, opening with the rhetorical questions, "Therefore, who among you is noble? Who is compassionate? Who is filled with love?" The authors aim to promote these virtues among the schismatics in Corinth, for the appropriate answer to these rhetorical questions is then given. "Let that one say, if there is a rebellion and strife and schism on account of me, I will depart," etc. The examples of self-sacrifice for the sake of others provided in 1 Clement 55 are therefore specifically framed as noble, compassionate, and loving acts done for the benefit of others, deeds that serve as paradigmatic examples for the Corinthians to imitate. In this sense, those who have willingly sold themselves into slavery in order to feed others might be said to have demonstrated the greatest of the virtues of 1 Corinthians 13, namely love. In giving themselves over to human masters, these Christians may have done something that runs counter to Paul's explicit instruction in 1 Corinthians 7:23, but they have done so, from the perspective of the authors of 1 Clement, in an implicit imitation of Christ Jesus, who is said to have given his flesh for our flesh and his life for our life. Finally, I want to say just a few words about slavery and social death, and then I want to raise some questions that I'm still sort of wrestling with as I think about this text in 1 Clement. Nowhere in 1 Clement do we clearly hear the perspective of enslaved persons themselves. The references to voluntary imprisonment and slavery in 1 Clement 55 are tantalizingly fleeting. Yet this passing allusion to what appear to be two practices well known to Christ followers in Corinth and Rome offers an opportunity to reconsider some fundamental frameworks through which slavery in early Christianity has often been viewed. Among the most influential perspectives on slavery in antiquity, and in other areas as well, or other eras as well, I should say, is Orlando Patterson's thesis that slavery be understood as social death, a status characterized by violence, natal alienation, and dishonor. Drawing on common experiences among slaves of violence, personal violation, and namelessness and invisibility, Patterson describes slavery as, quote, the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. Patterson concentrated his own study of slavery on what he calls the relation of domination, by which slaveholders maintained power over the enslaved. In doing this, Patterson, I think very importantly, shifted the focus from slavery as defined exclusively by questions of property rights to slavery as a kind of social death by which, quote, the desocialized new slave becomes incorporated into a personal relation and an institutional process in which a slave no longer belonged to a community and had no existence outside of his master, end quote. According to Patterson, social death is imposed and supported by two primary symbolic instruments: natal alienation, which means that the slave is cut off from all previous social ties, and pervasive dishonoring, which means that the slave could have no honor because he held no power and no independent social existence, and therefore no public worth. Now, I think his scholarship is immensely valuable and extremely important, and it really helps us to think about the experience of slavery from the perspective, to the extent that we can, of those who experienced it, which is very important. At the same time, Patterson's model for viewing slavery as social death has sometimes been challenged on the grounds that it does not satisfactorily highlight the agency of the enslaved themselves, and that Patterson's comparative approach does not sufficiently attend to the diverse experiences of slaves, including the lives of honor and communal support that slaves managed to build despite the brutal conditions often imposed upon them. Although the evidence is elusive and fragmentary, 1 Clement 55 would appear, at least to me, to offer one glimpse, or a small glimpse, into an experience of the enslaved that is not marked by social death, at least not entirely. Voluntary slavery in 1 Clement 55 is imaged as a practice that solidifies social bonds among Christ followers. Not only are those who have sold themselves into slavery counted among the community of Christ believers, they're referred to as many among us, but those who have made this sacrifice are honored by their vicarious deed, highlighted as an example of a noble, compassionate, and loving action. In this way, perhaps, social death cannot entirely capture the experience of those Christ followers who sold themselves into slavery in order to feed others. Like many members of many associations in the ancient Greco-Roman world, a majority, perhaps the overwhelming majority of early Christ followers in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era eked out a subsistence-level existence. 1 Clement 55 momentarily bears witness to the hardships of imprisonment and hunger, as well as to two practices, voluntary imprisonment and voluntary slavery, aimed at providing material assistance for those suffering these privations. One of the strengths of the study of Harland and Last, and their look at group survival in antiquity, is its reminder of the tenuous nature of continued existence, not only for individual members of associations in the ancient Mediterranean, but also for groups themselves. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. Christians in Rome and in Corinth were aware of examples of sacrificial love, and they are referenced in 1 Clement 55. To allow oneself to be imprisoned in order to ransom a brother or sister in Christ, or to give one's body into slavery in order to feed others with the price of the sale, these would seem to have exceeded normal practices of reciprocity. To what extent, if any, the practices of voluntary imprisonment and slavery and the rhetorical invocation of them in 1 Clement forged and solidified bonds among association members in Rome and Corinth and elsewhere is difficult to say. It is intriguing, however, that one of the earliest conjurings of the letter called 1 Clement alludes to communal bonds between Rome and Corinth, also fashioned through mutual assistance, including, probably, care for slaves. So sometime in the second half of the 2nd century, so sometime between 166 and 175, the Roman assembly appears to have sent a gift to Christ followers in Corinth. And a fellow named Dionysius, who was then bishop of Corinth, wrote a letter in response to the Roman church, fragments of which are preserved in Eusebius. In his letter, Dionysius acknowledges the regular and universal beneficence of the Romans. He writes, "For from the beginning this has been accustomed to you, always acting as a benefactor to siblings in various ways, and sending financial support to many assemblies in every city, thus relieving the poverty of those in want and supplying additional help to the siblings who are in the mines." Now, while metals were not exclusively extracted by slave labor in the Roman imperial period, Dionysius' phrase, "the brothers in the mines," I think, should be taken as a reference to Roman support for Christian slaves, although it's not clear if this care included the manumission of those slaves or simply the provision of material assistance to them. Dionysius goes on to observe that the letter called First Clement was still being read in Corinth during his time as bishop. "Today," he says, "we passed through the Lord's holy day in which we read your letter. When we read it, we will always have an admonishment, as also with the former letter written to us through Clement." The preservation and continued reading of First Clement in Corinth, perhaps a couple of generations or so after the epistle was first received, will have strengthened ties between Christ-following associations in Rome and in Corinth. And the memory of the noble, compassionate, and loving acts of voluntary imprisonment and slavery served as examples for the Corinthians to follow, both at the time First Clement was written and in the period of its earliest reception. In one sense, 1 Clement 55 is where the story of voluntary slavery in early Christianity ends. Now, that's not entirely true. I mentioned earlier that there are references to self-sale in two later monastic writings, one from the 5th and one from the 7th century. And in the interest of time, I won't recount those. But essentially, in the 5th century text, there's a well-educated monk who wears only a loincloth, who sells himself as a slave to a company of actors. And then, because of his constant witness and proclamation to them, they become Christians, and they leave the stage, and they offer to give him his money back. And he says, no, I can't take it. So they give the money to the poor instead. And in the 7th century text, there's a shop owner named Peter who frees one of his slaves, and then he convinces his slave to travel with him to Jerusalem so that the slave can sell him, that is Peter, into slavery himself, which does happen, and then he becomes a servant or slave, and he's serving people. There's a whole story that goes beyond this, where people from his hometown come and recognize him, and it's an interesting story. But the 30 pieces of silver that he receives for the sale of his own body are given to the poor as well. But aside from these two examples from monastic literature, I am unaware of any other instances of voluntary self-sale for the benefit of others in the patristic tradition. And if you know of some, I would love to hear about it, because I haven't come across any. And that raises a question that I cannot shake, and that has sort of bugged me for the past couple of years as I've thought about this. Why did the tradition of voluntary slavery not develop in early Christianity? At least two factors make this a very puzzling omission, at least to me, in the history of the Christian tradition. First, there did develop the practice of voluntary martyrdom. From the witness of Ignatius of Antioch, who eagerly anticipated his martyrdom in Rome and actively discouraged the recipients of his letter to Christ followers in Rome from intervening in his case, to tales of Christians who provoked authorities to arrest them with the goal of dying for their allegiance to Christ, there are multiple examples of Christians who intentionally sought martyrdom, even if both early Christian writers, such as Clement of Alexandria and the author of the Martyrdom of Polycarp, as well as modern scholars, expressed disdain for this practice. And there's a great essay by Paul Middleton on this particular topic. So regardless of what one makes of the frequency and suitability of voluntary martyrdom in early Christianity, there are more than a few examples of the practice. And yet, while some Christians were not merely willing to die for their faith, but actively pursued martyrdom, there is very little evidence that Christians voluntarily sold themselves into slavery. Second, the early Christian reticence with regard to voluntary enslavement, if we may call it that, is perhaps all the more puzzling given the scriptural traditions that might have resourced such a practice. One need think no further than the famous Christological text of Philippians 2, which says of Christ that though he was in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. If someone wanted to imitate Christ, becoming a slave might seem to be a reasonable practice. Might not believers seeking to imitate Christ have followed his example by becoming slaves? Or we might have thought of Paul's identification of himself as a slave of Christ in Romans 1:1, as perhaps spurring some Christians to embody this identity literally through self-sale. Yet despite a couple of examples from the monastic tradition, and despite the witness of 1 Clement 55, it does not appear that early Christians followed this path. It is, of course, possible that we just don't have the evidence for it, and it's almost impossible to answer the question of why people did not do a certain thing when there is no clear evidence regarding a road not taken. But if I had to hazard a guess, and I'm being very cautious here, I would say that voluntary enslavement in the Roman world was for the most part an option born of desperation. Christians, by and large, maybe, were not compelled to make that most difficult choice to sell themselves as slaves to be owned and exploited by others, because there existed mechanisms within Christ-following communities by which the destitute were able to receive material assistance that allowed them to avoid the awful fate of voluntary enslavement. And this connects with larger practices, emerging practices in the 2nd and 3rd centuries among Christians of care for the poor. And I just wonder if that partly explains why we don't see this phenomenon occurring more regularly in early Christian texts. But that really is a genuine question that I have and that I'm thinking about. But that's not what we see in 1 Clement 55, where some, or many, according to the authors of the letter, did willingly offer their bodies as property so that they might benefit others through this sacrifice. It seems to me that the example in 1 Clement 55 is the exception rather than the rule, and I have many questions about why that is the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes now for questions. Could I ask the first one, if possible? Sure. I have three in mind, but I'll just restrain myself to one. In the quotation from 1 Clement 55, the author mentions many Gentile kings in times of pestilence, have given themselves over to death. Who's that referring to? Is it referring? Do we know which particular Gentile kings that the author may have had in mind? Real, mythological, or?
Yeah, there are some examples from Greek tragedy that the authors could be evoking. They don't say, so it's hard to know for sure. They're clearly tapping into some sort of common assumed cultural knowledge, but they don't give us any particular indications. So there are various examples that are sort of trotted out. Right. The interesting thing to me about that text, this gets into another issue that I've wondered about and wrestled with, and actually a paper I gave to our New Testament seminar, was it last year? Yeah, last year, about the kind of the reference to their vicarious blood, that they might rescue subjects through their own blood. And one of the things that's interesting about 1 Clement is that it shares some similarities with the canonical epistle to the Hebrews. And there's been a whole debate in Hebrew scholarship about what we think of the nature of Jesus' atoning blood in Hebrews. And well, the sort of traditional view has been that Jesus' blood refers to Jesus' death in Hebrews. And a number of years ago, David Moffat published a very important and influential book called Resurrection and the Logic of Atonement in the Epistle to the Hebrews, I think, in which he makes the argument that blood in Hebrews does not refer to Jesus' death alone, but rather refers to the presentation of Jesus' blood in the heavenly temple, and is therefore very much connected to Jesus' resurrection and Jesus' ascension and enthronement. And he argues that partly because he thinks it's wrong to think of when you think of sacrifice in the Jewish tradition, of blood being about the death of the animal, but rather blood is about the release, Leviticus 17:11, the life of the animals in the blood. Blood is about the release of the life. So there's a whole process of sacrifice, and it's not just the killing, but also the presentation of the blood in a ritual manner that sort of makes the sacrifice. All that to say, I actually think the authors of 1 Clement connect blood with death pretty clearly. So unlike David's reading of Hebrews, I think blood and death are really closely connected in 1 Clement. And that represents to me perhaps a difference between the soteriology that we find in Hebrews and the soteriology that we find in 1 Clement, where we looked at chapter 49, verse 6, where it says that Jesus gave his life for your life, his soul for your, or his flesh for your flesh. So anyway, there's interesting things going on there related to sort of sacrifice and atonement. So that's an interesting text.
Okay.
Yeah, but in short, we don't really know if what particular examples he might be thinking of.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jones. I work a little bit on the Moravians and 18th century things, so we can talk more about St. Thomas would be interesting. But my question was more to do with saying more about the nature of slavery, and I'm glad you made the contrast between sort of race-based slavery in the 18th century and the complexity of slavery in the ancient world. But presumably slavery in the mines, like a lot of those would have been people vanquished in war and so on, or elements of race-based, if you like, racial slavery, household slaves. I'm reading Victor Hugo right now, and the Fantine sort of sells herself as a prostitute to save her daughter. And whether there's other, does that kind of thing happen in the ancient world? Is there a range of things? So when they talk about selling themselves into slavery, is that one thing, or could that be a number of possible kinds of things? Or should we think household slavery?
Yeah, it's a good question. We wish we had more evidence. There really is just not a lot of evidence. There are later Roman laws from the 3rd century and beyond that sort of legislate practices of self-sale, which seem particularly concerned with people being defrauded by someone who sells himself into slavery and then later says, actually, I wasn't a slave, and keeps the money and goes away. But in general, I mean, I think you're right to suggest that there does seem to have been quite a range of the kinds of positions that people would have been in when they undertook this choice. And I hesitate even. I sometimes wonder if the term voluntary slavery is itself problematic, because maybe for many people it's not a choice. It's just the only thing they can do to survive. So I think my sense is that in most cases it was the result of destitution, that there was no other option. And there is evidence to suggest that, in general, the fate of a poor slave could be better than the position of a freedman, because not a freedman, a free person, because at least one's owner has the impetus to provide food and shelter so that the slave can do the work that they're obligated to do. So people sometimes made this choice because it was better than starving. There is some evidence, though, that some people at more elevated social positions would sell themselves into slavery as a kind of legal mechanism by which they could obtain a better position, a better job. As slaves could possess peculium, which means that they could earn money, and then with the money that they earned, purchase their own freedom. So for some people, it seems like maybe it was a way to kind of move up the economic ladder. But for most people, I think it was just a sort of tragic choice that they had to make, born out of destitution. And I think for most followers of most Christians in this 1st and 2nd centuries, they were lower down on the socioeconomic rung. And so, I don't imagine Christians having the opportunity to kind of advance and become wealthy through this practice.
And I really like your counterfactual hypothetical, why didn't this happen, and your answer. I thought that was really good.
Well, yeah, I'm wondering about it. I'm curious, since you work on Moravians, have you heard about these Moravian slaves?
Yeah. And I mean, John Sensbach writes about this. This is also the first mass turning of African Americans to Christianity was on the island through the agency of Rebecca Proughton, a freed slave who worked there. And the argument that they make to the Blancan, the slaveholders, is we're more Christian than you are. So it's interesting, it's that same thing that you set up about who's really Christian and can you be Christian, and they made the argument back. We're actually more Christian than you because of how you're behaving and so on. But,
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
All these examples, apart from possibly the self-enslaving ones, are literary. Might it be a wise thing to go down the literary route with this as a way of explaining this example, and take Paul and indeed Christ as the ones that the author is talking about in 1 Clement?
Do you mean literary in what sense?
Literary in the sense that
Is it more of a rhetorical device?
well, not a rhetorical device per se, because it is a rhetorical passage. But the examples of Gentiles, yes, Oedipus and Colonus, and possibly some others in literature from myth or whatever. And then you've got Judith and Esther in this passage. So it's 3 attested literary ones, 2 consciously so and 1 implicitly so. And then the question mark over the instance of self-slavery. And that reminds me of the Hebrews passage which you mentioned, when you get some have entertained angels unawares, which seems to be talking about the specific example of Abraham. And it does suggest that, to me at least, that these are cases that you're going to find that you can read about. And might that be the way of understanding this one ambiguous, or not ambiguous, but uncertain passage?
So I guess I would push back on the notion that there's a difference between literary figures and historical figures for the author of a text like 1 Clement. I think, the letter is replete with examples, starting with Cain and Abel, who are referenced in chapter 4, all the way to, Christ himself, with an extended citation of Isaiah 53. His example of humility is referenced in chapter 16. So the idea that these are simply literary figures, I think, is not what...
That they would have, I'm sure they would have taken Oedipus, say, as a historical example. Literary, as in terms of, these are people you will have read about.
Yeah, although I think that the challenge to that is it's the en humin. There are many among us, which I think to me indicates that the authors are referring to contemporary examples of people that these readers would have known about. And if they were thinking specifically about Jesus, I suspect they would have said so, because he does serve as an example elsewhere in the letter. and Paul and Peter are mentioned in chapter 5. So I would maybe have anticipated more specificity if they were thinking about particular apostolic figures. But I don't think these are figures from the past. I think they're encouraging their readers to remember people that they knew about, either probably mostly in Rome, but possibly also in Corinth.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, David. I think there's an interesting connection perhaps between them selling themselves and them using the price they've received. And also, Clement has a very big emphasis on almsgiving. Do you think this example is almost raised as like, these guys are doing something very extreme, but actually maybe here's something that's probably a bit more accessible to you, and perhaps the reason why it doesn't show up so much in later examples is that people kind of decided maybe generosity just by giving what I have is an easier, sort of more palatable thing to do, and perhaps then as Christianity develops and there's more influence in the church and it becomes more acceptable within the empire, that it was just easier to give wealth than to just say sell oneself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean the authors clearly recognize some sort of economic diversity within among Christ groups. Like in chapter 38, they say, "Let the rich support the poor, and let the poor give thanks to God, because He has given him someone through whom his needs may be met." So they don't imagine, I think, that every person should give away all of their possessions, or every person should sell himself or herself into slavery. So I think, the reference in 38 is kind of what I think you're suggesting. We have to remember also that what we read about in chapter 55 is part of an appeal for those responsible for the schism to stop being involved and to leave. Right. So that's the sacrifice that they want those people to make, to voluntarily remove themselves from the situation by, I think, going to a different city. And the point that they're trying to get at is, look at all these examples that we know about of people giving their lives, of people being willing to be imprisoned and to sell themselves into slavery, of heroic women like Judith. If they can do those acts of sacrifice, you people responsible for the schism should be willing to move to a different town, basically. That's kind of what they're getting at.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Do you know about the there's a religious order in the Middle Ages, I think from the 13th century, called the Mercedarians? Have you heard of this religious order?
No.
Okay, so that, I think it was a response to Christians being enslaved by pirates from North Africa, and it was one of those religious orders from the 13th century, like the Dominicans and the Franciscans. But in addition to the usual vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, they took a fourth vow, which was to vow to hand themselves over, even unto death, to save an enslaved Christian from slavery. So they took this vow to make themselves always ready to take the place of an enslaved Christian, and because a lot of those enslaved Christians were pressured to renounce their faith or to be executed as slaves, often by Muslim pirates from North Africa, and so they would offer their lives to save them from giving up their faith. And I have no idea if this religious order in their practices was connected at all, was continuing a tradition in any way. It was probably just a response to that situation. But it is an interesting example of this.
Yeah, I should look into that.
I don't know when the religious order died out. It eventually did, but at least in the Middle Ages it was important for a time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah.
So, any other questions? Or we can draw things to a close now? Okay, well, please join me then in thanking Professor Downs for his lecture.
Yeah, thank you. I'll have to look up that.
Yeah, I know.
It'd be fascinating.